Welcome to Another Education is Possible. I am Nelly.
And I'm Y.
We also co-host with Jordan. In today's episode, we have a wonderful opportunity to talk to scholar Thea Abu El-Haj, whose work examines education as a deeply political space, one shaped by power, belonging, and exclusion. Education is often described as a neutral or liberatory institution. Yet for many students, especially those whose identities and histories are politically charged, schools and universities function as sites of constraint rather than freedom. Certain narratives are encouraged, while others are silenced. Some forms of grief are recognized, while others are treated as disruptive or inappropriate.
Thea Abu El-Haj's scholarship helps us understand how belonging in educational spaces can become conditional, granted unevenly, and revoked easily. Her work explores how Palestinian and Arab students navigate surveillance, censorship, and what has come to be known as the Palestinian exception to academic freedom. In this conversation, we discuss how knowledge is regulated in academic institutions, how students and educators respond to repression, and how education becomes a terrain of struggle over memory, history, and legitimacy. This episode invites listeners to rethink education, not only as a site of learning, but as a space where political boundaries are drawn and challenged. Let's begin.
Dr. Thea Abu El-Haj, welcome to Another Education is Possible. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me. I really
Thank you
appreciate
for
it.
we appreciate you being here. So actually I'm going to start kind of in a roundabout way. You've actually been kind of a thread through a lot of this podcast, which is something to throw at you right at the start. We've talked a lot about unsettled belonging and various in the first season. Strangely, it kept coming up, and a number of people have mentioned it, including myself, in this season. So maybe we could start by talking about your book, Unsettled Belonging, and kind of how it frames the educational experiences of Palestinian American students.
Sure. So, for listeners who don't know the book was an ethnographic study that I did over nearly a decade with Palestinian American transnational youth at a large urban high school and the surrounding areas. And I started the work, soon after 9/11, although I had conceptualized the work as the Second Intifada was unfolding, trying to understand, to reframe the conversations that we have about racially minoritized youth away from kind of issues of cultural identity and towards thinking about young people's political identities and practices. And I was particularly interested as a Palestinian myself, as somebody who actually lived and grew up in Iran and Lebanon, back and forth to Palestine to my family. I'm interested in kind of how politics get formed across different national boundaries. But I was also really interested in what were the experiences of young Palestinians in the US, and with both the struggle for Palestine and the incredible racialization, and racist discourses that they were facing, both because they were Palestinian and because they were Muslim post 9/11. So unsettled belonging emerges, I think about it as working in two dimensions. One is to really describe the ways that many young people today, and this is definitely true of Palestinians, but true of many other communities that are moving across spaces, is that people grow up with a sense of belonging to multiple places. So it's not that belonging and kind of the place that you're located aren't necessarily completely intertwined. So that's one sense of really, part of the book and the work is to really understand how young people develop understandings that because they have experiences across national territories. And for many of them, those were actual experiences of moving back and forth. But for some people, they had never left Philadelphia where they were, but they had, they had connections with family. They read Arabic media, listened to Arabic media, had Facebook interactions. And so all of that is part of this sort of sense that one might not just belong to one place, or that one might be living in one place and feeling a sense of belonging to another place. The other side of this, and this is the other side of the book, is kind of the ways that through really banal everyday practices of what I call US, I call it liberal multicultural nationalism, young Palestinians were learning that they did not belong, despite the fact that they were all US citizens. In this cohort, pretty much all US citizens. So they officially belong, but that belonging is conditioned on acting in particular kinds of ways, holding particular kinds of viewpoints, or not even anything. A lot of times the push out that they felt from people that were around them in the school had nothing to do with what they said or done. It was just projected on them because they were Palestinians, because they were Muslims, because they were Arabs. So I think that's the kind of way I think about this concept of unsettled belonging, that it's both a reality of modern life and that we have to kind of take that seriously. And part of the other thing I was trying to do is really intervene in the immigration literature that tends to ask questions about how do we get new communities to assimilate to the United States? What does it take to have them assimilate, rather than understanding that perhaps unsettledness is part of a modern, our modern global world in which we may not be going back to a sort of a place of not moving, or not both moving, again, imaginatively and physically. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I certainly don't want to exceptionalize this, but you talk about how you wrote this book in the wake of 9/11. The research started in the middle of the Second Intifada. I think you published it, was it 2015?
Mm-hmm. Ethnography takes a long time.
Yes. Yes.
For any of you wanting to write a book out there, if you're an ethnographer or a historian, it could take you a very long
time. So I wonder, does that framework hold? Again, not exceptionalizing the first and second Trump regimes, and not thinking of October 7th as, the emergence of a sudden genocide, but rather maybe an acceleration of these things. But how does that reframe or challenge or kind of push your idea to, in other words, does unsettled belonging hold?
Yeah, I think it holds in both the senses that I'm talking about. I think what we see in the student movement, nationally and internationally, in the last nearly 2+ years, is precisely the kind of transnational solidarities and understandings that the young people in my work represent. We're seeing people, again, not only Palestinians, which I think is the wonderful piece of this, really taking up the cause of political justice, at risk to themselves, sort of so that is part of, one of the things I argue in this book is that young people they come to understand rights and the lack of rights through the sort of disjunctures between their experiences in Palestine and their experiences in the US. So for many of them, or for some of them, it was actually going back to Palestine and encountering the Israeli military state and the ways that they suddenly had no rights, where they had felt some sense of rights here, that like really forged an understanding of both the ways that their US citizenship didn't protect them, right? Having rights-bearing citizenship in one place doesn't necessarily protect you in another place. But also a big refrain again and again was, what is this thing in the Constitution about liberty and justice for all, and the pledge that they had to do every day about liberty and justice for all, if all is only defined as certain people, right? Part of the work and the argument that I made is that many young people are asking, and again, I don't want to romanticize young people. There are plenty of young people and old people who are not standing for justice in all kinds of causes, who don't think don't think about forms of solidarity. But I think that there is also that possibility that young people hold today, and that, that the advocacy for political recognition and justice is one that crosses borders. So I think that holds, in that's what we're seeing. And we've seen many people who are not Palestinian, who don't have, any skin in that game, really cry out and be able to articulate what they're seeing. Where they're witnessing, as everyone has said again and again, a live stream genocide, and they're speaking out. And then the other side of that unsettled belonging we're also seeing, because what we're seeing is the conditional belonging. I think we're really seeing the very tail end, not the tail, I wish it was the end. We're seeing the long tail of the US war on terror. And I really think we can't understand the level of violence brought against the student protesters in the US if we don't understand this war on terror period as not having ended, but actually being ongoing. And I know I write about this in the book. I think about this a lot, that it was several days after the first speech that George Bush gave to the Congress after 9/11. He talks about either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. And that division of the world into who's visible and not visible, or as Judith Butler talks about, who's grievable, is so clear right now. So we have pronouncement after pronouncement after pronouncement from our university administrations about the ostensible, presumptive glorification of violence that the student protesters are. I mean, student protesters are calling for ceasefires, right? And they're being tagged as supporting terrorism, da 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 da. And those who are yelling no ceasefire are being framed as being perfectly somehow human and reasonable. So I think that has everything to do with this, profoundly problematic racial formation that positions anybody who appears to be Muslim in any way to support Muslims, to, again, we don't see Palestinian Christians. I think those are tied up. I also think that, and this is something that I wrote about in Unsettled Belonging at length, is the invisibility of US empire. It's US empire that makes those things possible. People, that was the thing that I think troubled many educational researchers in particular the most, is what's she doing talking about empire? Like, is this some left-wing rhetoric that she's throwing around that has nothing to do with reality? But I actually think you can't understand the ways that Palestinians in this context, and then I've done other work with larger Muslim immigrant communities, the way that they are positioned as never being able to fully belong to the US without understanding empire, without understanding that the racializations that happen in the United States are not solely those that happen inside the borders, that those borders extend. So we often talk about race just in terms of internally racialized populations, but not externally ones, those that are, again, caught up in our empire. And I think what we start to see as the genocide unfolds is the lining up. Sorry, this is a lot of a mouthful. I might need to back up a second and talk a little bit about liberal multicultural nationalism. Many scholars have argued there's this shift that happens in the mid sort of last century, where post World War II, the United States is, trying to promote itself as the, beacon of democracy. The Cold War is going, and we've got a racial dictatorship in the South here. The United States is being called out internationally for the the extreme levels of violence and control against particularly our Black citizens. there's an argument that what happens discursively is that the United States starts promoting itself as a multicultural nation, that we're liberal, but we're also liberal and multicultural. And we can all live together. We're a nation of immigrants. I mean, think about that statement in this moment, right? And that becomes the dominant way that people understand the United States as a nation state. That the national imaginary is this multicultural one. We're free, we're tolerant, we appreciate diversity. That's who we are and that vision gets built up then against, in particular, what Layla Abu El-Haj has called Islam land, right? Like this kind of nebulous other space geography. I mean, of course, Edward Said gets huge credit for this, really, as a beginning with Orientalism and other work, but to really understand the way that the Orient, and in particular also then Muslim majority areas, regions, nations. I mean, again, to Americans, they don't even know where this is, right? Iran is Arab, is Afghani, it's this kind of global boogeyman of amorphous places that are seen as not diverse, are seen as oppressive, as seen as, working against the individual, being driven by culture as if everybody's lockstep moving in that. And so all kinds of things become possible within that, within that framework. So, we have a lot of, we hear on our campus a lot, zero tolerance for violence, but again, whose violence again, there's been no violence. Ostensible violence is seen as a problem. I saw this very much in my work, is that we have zero tolerance for intolerance, but what is made visible as intolerant is never the intolerance of the dominant US narrative. So now I'm coming forward into this idea that I think when we see what happened in the last 2 years is kind of this, how do we understand the lining up of nearly every European Union, US, Australia, et cetera, et cetera? How do we see the lining up of all these states with Israel's project? I think it's around this kind of shared notion that they are all the liberal democracies defending the world against, violence, intolerance, Muslims, et cetera. I think we have to understand those kind of affective engagements. Does that need more clarification? Is that sensible?
Incredibly thorough. I'm wondering about the encampments, because your focus in the book was on K-12 schooling, and now we'll get to your current research in a bit, and some of the, I don't know if the word controversy does it justice. Repression is probably the way to frame it, but I think the encampments offer this really powerful contestation of this notion of unsettled belonging and education set within and yet against empire. For today, the three of us read your CAE award speech. I think within that you talk about in 1982, you were one of, what was it, 4 people protesting. I think I'm just interested in hearing your take on how the encampments contest this notion of liberal, multicultural, capitalist education and the role of education as a force to reproduce and thus produce also within that this notion of unsettled or conditional belonging.
Yeah. I think the encampments and the ongoing resistance is an incredible story about, and I mean, I know everyone says this, and I think this is true. I mean, I imagine that I don't know how many years it's going to take Columbia to hang their pictures on the wall and be like, oh, these were our students, like along with Vietnam, along with South Africa, that were standing for justice, right?
And donate money.
Yes, and donate money, yeah. Although I can say as a Palestinian who I did not grow up here, I came here from the middle of the Civil War and in Lebanon, and was not able to go back after 82. My family was evacuated in the middle of that invasion. I did not think I would ever see this level of support in my lifetime. I really didn't. So, because it's not new, right? Like, I mean, in some ways, that the shocking thing to me in 1982 was the world watched what the Israelis did in Lebanon, right? And they watched, and the protest that I talk about was the three of us standing out there after the massacres in Sabra and Shatila. So in Lebanon, what happens for listeners who don't know, is there's an Israeli invasion. It starts on June, I think, 6th. It continues until in August, the Israelis negotiate that the PLO and all their fighters will leave, and they leave to Tunisia on boats, and they basically leave so any male of ostensible fighting age was gone, and they leave the camps entirely with no protection, and entirely filled mostly with elderly men and women and children. Of course, the only people who are deemed innocent. And then the Israeli army surrounded the camps in Sabra and Shatila and sent in their paramilitary and lit the camps and watched as they massacred the Lebanese militia massacred about, I think it was quite several thousand people. And there were three of us, right, protesting. And people said to me all through my college career, everyone was like protesting what was going on in Central America, but so even the lefties would be like, yeah, but I can't touch Palestine. Too complicated. I don't want to get in trouble, right? And then there was just everybody else who just, when I got to Swarthmore, which was really my first, I was born in the States, but I left when I was teeny, 2 or 3, came back to go to college. And my first week, I had swastikas drawn on my door. I had Nazi, I had Jew hater written across my door. I hadn't said anything. I said I was Palestinian. I didn't nothing. So it was a very intense environment. There was really no knowledge about Palestine. And again, there were 3 of us in the face of this horrific invasion. Here we are. The sad piece is that it's taken this long. And I can tell you that some of the young people in my life feel like this is what it took. Like it takes a genocide for people to understand what's been going on. Like it's inexcusable. And I have to agree, right? It is kind of inexcusable. But it happened. And I think that I am convinced that the level of repression against the encampments and against the subsequent student protests is completely related to the ways that the Israelis have lost control of the narrative. Like it is no longer possible for most people to believe that the state of Israel is not committing a genocide, has not been doing it in an ongoing way, is not a settler colonial state, is not land grabbing. I think that's why there's this level of repression and also this level of destruction in Gaza and also in the West Bank, and which is invisible right now, right? Completely invisible to most people. But back to your question about students, I think so. Students are clearly calling the dominant narratives into question. But I think the other thing the encampments are so clearly doing is calling out what the university has become, right? That the university has become driven by its endowment driven, and those endowments are being built on the lives and backs of other people through the investments they're making. I think we're seeing that. I think we're seeing young people saying no to the genocide, but no to supporting a military industrial complex. And that's where, yeah, I think it's calling for, this is, I don't know, is this the largest international solidarity movement in the world in recent years, at least? I think it is. So, and I think that students here are saying, and not on are seeing the connections because they know that it is US money that is responsible. It is US bombs that is responsible for what happened. And that's back to what you said a little earlier about I think we both have to understand what's different about Trump and both the Trump administrations, but also see the continuity with the Democratic, sort of regimes that have been in power. If Biden had not supported the genocide in the way that he did, we would not be where we are right now. Whatever Trump did when he came in, we would not be there. And possibly the Democrats would not have lost the White House. I don't know, but that's a possibility.
Thank you so much. I was reading one of your interviews in the newspaper where you were mentioning if the universities are not willing to stand up for what is core to their mission, I don't know what they are doing. What's the point? So given the many recent examples of censorship of pro-Palestinian speech, including event cancellations, restrictions, or protests, what specific actions do you believe that universities should take to remain true to their mission?
I know what they should do. I have zero faith that any university administration is going to do that. They should be loud and clear in support of academic freedom and freedom of expression. In an ideal world, our universities would be functioning as some kind of, with all my caveats around what we mean by democracy and whether democracy was really always just empire in disguise. But let's take some ideal idea that we could come together as a diverse public and actually have conversation and use research and evidence as a way of understanding and taking action on issues of public concern. So ideally, the university would be supporting all of that. I have, again, no faith that any administration is going to do that. And so I think it's the job of professors and students now to really keep demanding and to not silence themselves and to, be willing to risk a lot, because I think it's going to be about risking a lot, and to, again, to use the overused phrase, just continue to speak truth to power. Otherwise, I don't know what we're doing. My university, as part of a settlement, Columbia settled with the Trump administration, Barnard settled with a law firm. They've adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism. So can I teach my class growing up Palestinian? Yeah, I will. I have to. I don't even know how we do this anymore. Like, how do we do this in the space between what they're sort of asking or demanding? And it's incoherent. Like, it's an incoherent definition. When we collapse state policies with discrimination against a people, that's kind of, then what's next? Can we call out human rights in any state if a person feels identified with that state? Can we call out the human rights violations of the United States if people feel like that's somehow against them because they identify with those policies? I don't even know what we do anymore, but I think it's going to take professors and students, and I think we are seeing a small group of professors, a large group of students be willing to take this up.
Professor, you also describe how student protesters teach through their questions, actions, and building community. In your opinion, how can universities better recognize and support, in the ideal world, yes, this kind of student-led education, particularly pro-Palestinian activism or something like that?
Again, I don't think the universities are going to do it. They could start by not calling the riot police in every time there was a protest, right? Putting our students at incredible risk. I was on sabbatical in the 2023-24 years, so I was not on campus that year. But last year I was, and witnessed what it was like to be in the middle of a police action against students who were chanting and drumming, and had evacuated the building that they were in the minute the police showed up. And we're lucky. I feel like we are lucky so far that no one has been, frankly, mortally wounded by the police. We do know that in Hamilton Hall, also known as Hins Hall, 2 years ago, there was an officer discharged their weapon. and it just happened to hit a wall and not a student. So we were one bullet away from a Kent State situation. And I think that's really deeply troubling and worrisome. So the first thing would be stop calling the police and bringing in people with guns on our students. The second thing would be actually, to create a space for people to talk, to disagree. I think that there's a level of, and I think that we have to stop defining safety as never having to hear things that you don't want to hear. I hear things that are said about Palestinians all the time that are awful, right? That, that are racist, that are, that's my whole life here. I don't know a Palestinian who goes through education and doesn't hear things that are deeply troubling. So we shut down speech. We don't, I don't know what we do with, we have to redefine that. But again, I don't think it's the administrations that are going to do that. I think it's the faculty and the students that are going to keep pressing, making demands, working with our AAUPs, working with the student unions. I think that's what we have to do.
Thank you, Professor. I actually have one question. In moments when institutions suppress Palestine-related scholarship or any kind of activism, such as the cancellation of the Harvard Journal issue, what do you see as the long-term consequences for knowledge production, academic freedom, and also the ability of marginalized communities to narrate their own histories?
It's a really good question. I think a lot of things. One is, I think we're going to have to find alternative spaces when things are totally shut down to do this work. And my worry about the censorship is discouraging young scholars to take up the question of Palestine, right? Because if you're a young scholar and you want to work on Palestine, you know that your job prospects might be much less, right? All that stuff is real. I think I don't know a Palestinian that stopped yet, but it may stop other people from taking this up. So I think it's going to take a lot of, again, brave professors, brave students to say, this is what I'm working on. I do want to say that so you mentioned the cancellation of the Harvard Educational Review. And again, for listeners who don't know about this, there was a special issue of the Harvard Educational Review on education on Palestine that was accepted, publicized, and slated to come out last summer. And the Harvard Education Press canceled the entire issue when the authors, of whom I am one, refused to allow the press to send our articles to Harvard's Office of General Counsel for a risk assessment around anti-Semitism. We said, absolutely not. That's censorship. Again, what do lawyers know about, education on Palestine? And they canceled the entire issue, making up some excuses about copy editing disputes. You don't cancel a journal issue around copy editing disputes. So on the one hand, that's terrible. And I've been told directly, and I can't prove this, but I'm fairly certain. And this was told to me by several people at Harvard that it had to do with Harvard's adoption of IRA in the settlement of their lawsuit. So there are now what constitutes anti-Semitism. But so that's bad, right? And I think the kind of thing that we need to always remember is Palestine's canary in the coal mine. They're going after everybody. This is going to happen around environmental issues. It's going to happen around, we're seeing it already. I mean, Florida is the poster child for shutting down conversation about trans research and issues, conversation about critical race theory, any race theory, right? Palestine is an exception. It's also on a parallel with a lot of other things that are happening in this country. That has to be in our sights, because this kind of censorship and repression is going to be across many, many, many communities. And I want to say that we got offers from many, many editors of journals to that they would just take the issue. And curriculum inquiry and which is University of Toronto, Oisey's journal, has taken the special issue. So I think, there are brave editors out there, right? There are people who are still standing up for this, and we just have to do everything we can to create that space and to make sure that that tiny space is still open. So again, we just have to keep doing the work. I mean, think about what people are doing in Gaza, right? In the midst of all this, the writing, the journalism, the people who, every journalist is putting their life at risk, right? And yet they're still telling these stories. They're not, I know there's no safe place to hide, but you know what I'm saying, that, and they're being targeted. They're being targeted and assassinated, and they're still speaking out. So if people can take that kind of level of risk, then those of us who have some level of protection have to do, so much more.
To kind of bring us to a close here, I think that leads perfectly into your current work. So I know that you're doing some research with teachers who survived the Nakba. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned earlier writing a book on scholasticide. So I'm wondering if we can think with Palestinian teachers and imagine, what does it look like for education to, a lot of this conversation has been about education in kind of this negative space. What does it look like for education to be the opposite, to maybe be a force of collective liberation, for it to be a force of resistance, possibly something else?
Yeah. So the work I'm doing right now with a team of other scholars in Lebanon is, we've been doing an oral history project with Palestinian teachers who worked in UNRWA schools at a moment when UNRWA is being shut down, and when the attacks on UNRWA as being like, supporter of terrorism, blah, 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 are just unbelievable and completely without foundation. So the teachers were all Nakba generations, so they're either born right before or right after the Nakba, the first generation of stateless Palestinians in Lebanon. They became teachers in the late 60s and early 70s, so that's the time in where the Palestinian Thawra, or the revolution, is at its height, and Lebanon becomes the center of the Palestinian national movement after they're kicked out of Jordan by the king of Jordan, massacred and kicked out. And then they taught through the civil war, the Lebanese civil war. So through the PLO's expulsion from Lebanon, through the civil war into the early 2000s. And the story is, their stories are amazing. These are ordinary teachers, right? They're working mostly in elementary schools. There aren't very many. Initially, there's no secondary education for Palestinians. There's still very little. So these are teachers who are, through their everyday practice of teaching, consistently talking about education and knowledge as there's a saying they say in Arabic again and again, knowledge is our strongest weapon, right? And that, this where the spaces for any conversation about Palestine were almost non-existent, they created those spaces. So there is a teacher who wrote 600 books about Palestine so that kids could have resources. There's a teacher who, there are many teachers who talked about, teaching. There's a teacher who made all these like topographical maps of the villages that the communities came from. And then there's many stories like that. There's people who were involved in scouting, in the sports leagues that brought Palestinians from around Lebanon and then regionally together to kind of really work on maintaining a sense of Palestinian national consciousness and the right of return, which they speak about to this day. I've been really thinking about, for the last many years too, are the little tiny acts that teachers do that people don't recognize, right? The acts of care, going to families' homes when the kids have dropped out of school to convince them to come back. going to school, like figuring out how to hide your own fear to protect kids during bombings and shellings. So all that work that they've done that is really, very clearly committed, and we're very clearly committed as teachers to maintaining young people's sense of being Palestinian. Initially in Lebanon, the Deuxième Bureau, the Secret Service, whatever you call them, they were very repressive in the camps, and in the 50s and 60s, teachers were taken away and tortured if they talked about Palestine, and they still kept up. What has happened? I mean, the way refugee education works is that you follow the curriculum of the country in which you live. Lebanon teaches no history. I mean, partly because they don't want to even teach about their own history. I think that the Lebanese history books stop in the 1940s. They haven't dealt with their own civil war and sectarian violence. So there's essentially nothing about Palestine. And again, teachers are figuring out how to introduce things. Post 82, and especially post Oslo, there's lots of pressure from the Israelis and the Americans and the international community on UNRWA to make sure that the curriculum is completely neutral, right? And neutral looks like promoting children's right to play and peace education and this and that, and telling teachers that singing songs about Palestine is not promoting peace, etc. Right? And the teachers are very clear in their critiques. They're like, we have a human rights curriculum. Where are the Palestinian kids' human rights? You're talking about a right to play, but the Israelis are bombing schools and schoolyards. Like, what right to play do children have? We have been working mostly in UNRWA we have been working with UNRWA teachers to try to have that history. There's a long history of Palestinian resistance that's also out of schools, right? People setting up when the schools are closed in the first Intifada and the second, people setting up, again, community spaces for schools. We see that now in Gaza. In Lebanon, there's plenty of other places where kids get education that's not formal education. So I think you see Palestinians have sustained this pushback against the erasure that that settler colonialism wants for our, history, culture, politics, etc. I think we have to really keep eyes on what's going to happen now in Gaza. I'm really worried that what we're going to see we already see the Israelis dismantling the existing schools, right? I mean, UNRWA is not a perfect system, but it does serve a lot of children, and the rates of literacy and education in Gaza were very high before the genocide, despite the siege and blockade, despite the incredible poverty rates, which the Palestinians in Gaza has had like a 97% literacy rate before, and graduation rate before 2023. I'm worried about who's going to swoop in and set up new schools that are completely culturally irrelevant, that are politically irrelevant, that will not be able to deal with the trauma that young children have experienced, that will not be. I think we're in a struggle of stripping people of their Palestinian, as one teacher said, what they want to strip us of our Palestinianness, like to provide education, which will be good for the kids. I don't know what that even means if it's stripped of any kind of content, versus kind of Palestinians pushing for our right to have a different kind of indigenous knowledge production.
I just want to thank you for this interview. I actually took a lot of notes that will be very helpful for my research. I'm really excited for the book that you're going to publish soon. And thank you so much for this full session with you.
Yeah, well, thank you. I definitely want to hear more about your work.
Today's episode was produced by all of us in the Education, Genocide, Liberation class. If you like our podcast, please like, rate, subscribe, give comments. You can also follow us on Instagram, where another ed is possible. We've been posting on LinkedIn and sometimes remembering to post on Blue Sky. Thanks as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.